What do these anti-Jewish attacks now tell us of Australia today?
Well, it's a very grave moment that we're living through. We've never seen anti-Semitism in this country on this scale before. In the 1930s, when Jews were being harassed and persecuted in Europe, we appointed our first Australian Governor-General, Australian-born, Sir Isaac Isaacs, who was Jewish in World War I. We went to a militiaman and an engineer for our supreme military leadership, John Monash, who was Jewish. Our country hasn't had a tradition of anti-Semitism, but we've got it now. And it comes from three sources. Contemporary anti-Semitism comes from three sources. You've got traditional right-wing racist anti-Semitism. You've got the new ideological left-wing anti-Semitism, which comes from wildly demonising Israel as part of the West and seeing it as part of Western colonialism and so on. And you've got the distinctive tradition of Arab and Islamist anti-Semitism, and they all seem to be mixing in Australia at the moment. I think the Albanese government, which is certainly not anti-Semitic in any way itself, nonetheless bears responsibility at two levels. One, it never understood the gravity of the crisis and was reluctant to confront the crisis or acknowledge the crisis or deal with it in any way, has been dragged kicking and screaming to acknowledge the crisis. And secondly, what you've been talking about earlier, if you demonise Israel, even if you yourself are not anti-Semitic, if you demonise Israel beyond a reasonable point, you encourage emotional folks to think that Israel is such an evil entity that any method of expressing opposition to Israel is okay. Now, you're not explicitly encouraging that, but that's the effect of what you do. So the International Holocaust Remembrance Association defines one aspect of anti-Semitism as the wild over-demonising of Israel. Now, in a sense, the left wing of the Labor Party had a point. What was Mark Dreyfus doing in Israel, talking to the Israeli government, if the Albanese government believes Benjamin Netanyahu is a war criminal and should be prosecuted before the International Criminal Court? So the Albanese government didn't have the moral strength to denounce that preposterous prosecution by the ICC. So at the one time, the Albanese government tries to maintain its left-wing inheritance, which includes a lot of nutty stuff, and at the same time be a responsible government, including responsible to the Australian community. There's a contradiction there which the Albanese government hasn't been able to manage.
I would say there's actually now a fourth river of anti-Semitism, and that's identity politics. I think Jews happen to be too white, too Western, too rich, too successful, too capitalist, and too easy to falsely portray as colonialists in their own country. And therefore, they cop it as well. I think that's supercharging it. To Albanese today, I think there's been an absolute panic stations in his office today. This afternoon, he also finally gave in to the opposition's demands to call a national cabinet meeting, including all state leaders, to crack down on these attacks. Opposition leader Peter Dutton also says, let's have new laws, 6 years jail minimum for violent anti-Jewish attacks. I wonder, Greg, how much of this is going to be effective? Because no one's talking about immigration to cut off the supply. No one's talking about reforming education systems, cracking down on universities that seem to be spreading this kind of stuff. How much can we hope from cabinet meetings and things like that?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right, Andrew. Two things. I mean, the government is taking no effective action. It's taking no effective action at all. It's talking about law enforcement. That's useful. But there's no effective action to reform the long-term incubators of hate-filled anti-Semitism, such as what happens in our education system, what happens in the universities, and so on. So you're absolutely right about that. But then secondly, why has Albanese been so reluctant to have a national cabinet meeting? I mean, and you don't have a national cabinet meeting as an emergency panic-stricken telephone hookup. His own advisor, his own envoy on anti-Semitism was begging him to do this. Now, what you should do if you're serious about this is convene a meeting in person of every Premier and every Territory Chief Minister and the Prime Minister in Canberra in front of all the cameras so that you get maximum national attention. I mean, Andrew, I'm the most loyal Sky viewer in the world, but I happen to watch SBS News Bulletin tonight. They didn't get to the anti-Semitism crisis until more than 30 minutes into a 60-minute news bulletin. Now, if you were really giving leadership on this issue, you would have a national cabinet meeting with everybody there in person, with the Prime Minister flanked by every elected state government and territory minister in Australia saying this is absolutely wrong. We affirm that Australia stands with our Jewish population and this anti-Semitism is despicable and we all hate it, every one of us, from the left wing of the Labor Party to the Conservative end of the National Party. And Albanese won't do that, God knows why. But one possible motive is because if you do all that, you'll upset the left-wing activist base, which is 10, 20, 25% of the Labor vote. And but politics is not a place for cowards. You either stand up to that or you give in to it, and you can't have a foot in both camps.
But you put your finger right on it. There is, in fact, a whole stream, a whole culture supporting this, and that's what needs to be attacked. And that also includes reversing some of these terrible policies that this government has said, like, for instance, taking our embassy back out of Jerusalem, not acknowledging that Jerusalem is Israel's capital. Things like that. It's just ridiculous. Greg Sheridan, thank you so much for your common sense in a country that seems to be losing it at the top. Thank you so much.